The basketball stars thought they were teaching the weird kid a lesson when they shoved him into locker 247 and walked away laughing. What they didn't know was that Ethan Parker had an older brother who'd spent 4 years learning combat techniques in the Marines, and Jake Parker was about to show them exactly what happens when you mess with family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lincoln Valley High School sat nestled in the heart of Millbrook, Oregon, where autumn leaves painted the small town in brilliant oranges and reds. The school's brick facade had weathered decades of students, but inside those walls, some traditions never seemed to change. The strong preyed on the weak, the popular ruled the hallways, and those who didn't fit the mold learned to navigate carefully through each day. Ethan Parker understood this reality better than most. At 16, he possessed a brilliant mathematical mind that could solve complex equations in his head while his classmates struggled with basic algebra. His teachers marveled at his ability to spot patterns others missed and his uncanny knack for remembering every detail of their lessons. But Ethan's autism made the social landscape of high school as foreign and treacherous as walking through a minefield blindfolded. He kept his dark hair neatly combed, his clothes pressed and organized, and his backpack arranged with the precision of a Swiss watch. Every morning, Ethan followed the same routine down to the minute. He arrived at school at exactly 7:45, walked the same path to his locker, and arranged his books in the same order they appeared on his schedule. This predictability gave him comfort in a world that often felt chaotic and overwhelming. His classmates saw his routines as weird quirks, his literal interpretations of their sarcasm as stupidity, and his difficulty reading social cues as an invitation for cruel entertainment. What they failed to understand was that behind Ethan's sometimes awkward exterior lived a gentle soul who simply experienced the world differently than they did. 20 miles away, Jake Parker was wrapping up another grueling day at Morrison's auto shop, his hands black with grease and his Marine Corps tattoo visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves. At 22, Jake had returned to Millbrook after serving 4 years in the military, including 2 deployments overseas that had taught him more about violence and its consequences than any young man should ever learn. He'd come home to help his mother Linda, who worked double shifts at Millbrook General Hospital to keep their small family afloat after their father had abandoned them years earlier. Jake's protective instincts toward his younger brother ran deeper than most siblings understood. He'd been the one to teach Ethan how to tie his shoes when the fine motor skills came slowly. He'd been the one to explain why other kids sometimes said things they didn't mean, helping Ethan navigate the confusing world of social interaction. Most importantly, Jake had been the one to promise their mother that he'd always watch out for Ethan, no matter what. The brothers couldn't have been more different on the surface. Where Ethan was methodical and predictable, Jake was adaptable and spontaneous. Where Ethan struggled with social nuances, Jake could read people like open books. Where Ethan preferred the safety of routines, Jake thrived on challenges and change. But beneath these differences lay an unbreakable bond forged through years of facing the world together as a team. At Lincoln Valley High, Tyler Brooks ruled his domain with the confidence that came from being the star player on a basketball team that hadn't lost a home game in 2 seasons. Standing 6 feet 4 inches with the kind of natural athleticism that college scouts drooled over, Tyler had grown accustomed to a world that bent itself around his desires. Teachers overlooked his missing assignments, administrators ignored his behavioral issues, and his peers either worshipped him or feared him. Tyler's cruelty wasn't born from poverty or abuse or any of the typical explanations that might excuse such behavior. He came from a comfortable middle-class family where his parents attended every game and proudly displayed his trophies in their living room. His meanness stemmed from something simpler and perhaps more disturbing. He enjoyed the power that came from making others feel small, and he'd learned that his athletic status made him virtually untouchable. Connor Hayes served as Tyler's eager lieutenant, a wannabe tough guy who compensated for his own insecurities by attaching himself to someone more powerful. Connor's sharp tongue and cruel wit made him the perfect accomplice for Tyler's schemes, always ready with a cutting remark or a vicious prank. He lived for the approval that came from making Tyler laugh at someone else's expense. Mason Riley completed their trio, though his role was more complicated than the others. Where Tyler was the leader and Connor was the instigator, Mason was the reluctant follower who went along because the alternative meant becoming a target himself. Deep down, he knew their behavior was wrong, but his fear of social exile kept him silent and complicit in their cruelty. The three had noticed Ethan during their first week of the school year, marking him as different in the way that predators instinctively identify vulnerable prey. His careful routines, his tendency to avoid eye contact, and his literal responses to their sarcastic comments made him an irresistible target for their entertainment. Their campaign against Ethan began subtly, as these things often do. They would deliberately bump into him in the hallways, causing his carefully organized books to scatter across the floor. They would make loud comments about his appearance or his behaviors, ensuring everyone nearby could hear their mockery. They discovered that Ethan had difficulty understanding when they were being sarcastic, so they would ask him ridiculous questions with straight faces, then laugh when he answered seriously. Sarah Martinez had watched this pattern develop with growing disgust and helplessness. As a junior who'd grown up in Millbrook, she knew better than to directly confront the basketball stars, but she tried to help Ethan in small ways when she could. She would help him gather his books when they were knocked down, offer him a seat at her lunch table when his usual spot was taken, and try to redirect conversations when the teasing became particularly cruel. Sarah had a younger brother with ADHD, and she recognized in Ethan the same vulnerability that made her brother a target for bullies at his own school. She'd tried talking to Mrs. Chun, one of the few teachers who seemed to genuinely care about all her students, but the response was always the same. Without concrete evidence of serious wrongdoing, there was little the administration could do to control student behavior outside of class. Mrs. Chun had indeed noticed the dynamic developing around Ethan, and it troubled her deeply. As a special education advocate who'd worked with autistic students for over a decade, she could see how the constant stress was affecting his academic performance and emotional well-being. But Tyler and his friends were careful to keep their worst behavior away from teacher supervision, and the unwritten rules of high school hierarchy protected them from serious consequences. The basketball team's success had made them local celebrities in a town where Friday night games were the highlight of the social calendar. Coach Reynolds, whose job security depended on maintaining their winning streak, had made it clear that his star players received special treatment. Disciplinary issues were handled internally, academic problems were smoothed over, and complaints from other students were generally dismissed as jealousy or attention-seeking. This protective bubble around the basketball players had emboldened Tyler and his friends to escalate their harassment of Ethan throughout the fall semester. They would follow him between classes, making comments loud enough for him to hear, but quiet enough to avoid teacher intervention. They would take pictures of him without permission, sometimes posting them online with cruel captions that their followers would eagerly share and mock. Ethan began dreading school in a way that broke his mother's heart. Linda Parker had always worried about how her younger son would navigate the social challenges of adolescence, but she'd hoped that his intelligence and gentle nature would eventually win over his classmates. Instead, she watched him become increasingly withdrawn, his appetite disappearing and his carefully maintained routines beginning to show cracks under the pressure. Jake noticed the changes in his brother immediately. Ethan had always been quiet, but now he seemed almost ghost-like, moving through their house as if he were trying to make himself invisible. When Jake asked about school, Ethan would give short, evasive answers that clearly hid deeper troubles. Jake's protective instincts, honed by years of military training and sibling responsibility, began sending up warning signals that something was seriously wrong. The Parker family had always been close, drawn together by the necessity of relying on each other, through their father's abandonment and their mother's demanding work schedule. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They shared dinners when Linda's shifts allowed it, with Jake helping Ethan with homework and Ethan helping Jake understand the more complex aspects of the computer programming courses he was taking at the community college. These evening conversations had always been a source of connection and comfort for all three of them. But lately, Ethan had been skipping these family dinners, claiming he wasn't hungry or had too much homework to complete. Jake would find him in his room, staring at textbooks without actually reading them, or sitting at his computer without typing anything. The mathematical formulas and programming codes that usually fascinated Ethan seemed to hold no interest for him anymore. Meanwhile, at school, Tyler and his friends had grown bolder in their torment of Ethan. They discovered that he had a particular sensitivity to loud, unexpected noises, so they would deliberately slam lockers when he walked by or shout his name suddenly to watch him flinch. They learned that he struggled with changes to his routine, so they would block his usual path between classes or sit in his regular seat in the cafeteria, forcing him to navigate new and uncomfortable situations. The cruelty was becoming more sophisticated and more personal. Connor had figured out Ethan's locker combination by watching him enter it repeatedly, and they would occasionally rearrange his books or leave crude notes among his belongings. Mason, despite his misgivings, had used his computer skills to create fake social media accounts that they used to send Ethan confusing and sometimes threatening messages. Sarah Martinez had tried multiple times to intervene more directly, but her attempts to help often backfired and resulted in increased harassment for both her and Ethan. She'd complained to her parents, who'd spoken to the school administration, but Tyler's family had connections throughout the town's power structure, and complaints against him rarely resulted in meaningful consequences. The tension had been building for months like pressure in a steam engine, and everyone who paid attention could sense that something had to give. Ethan's carefully constructed coping mechanisms were beginning to fail under the constant stress, while Tyler and his friends grew increasingly confident that their behavior would never face serious consequences. Jake had begun picking up Ethan from school more frequently, partly to spend time with his brother, but mostly because his instincts told him that Ethan needed protection from something he wasn't talking about. During these car rides home, Jake would try to draw Ethan into conversation about his day, his classes, and his classmates, but Ethan had become expert at deflecting these inquiries with minimal responses that revealed nothing important. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late October, when the autumn air carried the promise of winter and the basketball team was preparing for their season opener. Tyler and his friends had been particularly energized by the approaching game, their confidence boosted by newspaper articles predicting another championship season and college recruiters who'd already begun making preliminary contact. It was also the day that everything Ethan had built to protect himself would come crashing down, and Jake Parker would discover exactly what had been happening to his little brother. That Tuesday morning started like any other for Ethan Parker. He arrived at Lincoln Valley High at exactly 7:45, his internal clock as precise as always. The October air held a crisp bite that reminded him winter was approaching, and he'd carefully selected his navy blue sweater and khaki pants the night before, ensuring they were wrinkle-free and properly coordinated. His backpack contained exactly the items he needed for each class, organized in the order he would need them throughout the day. The hallways buzzed with their usual pre-class energy as students congregated around lockers, sharing weekend stories and cramming for first period tests. Ethan navigated through the crowd with practiced efficiency, keeping his eyes focused on his destination and avoiding the random, social interactions that could derail his carefully planned morning routine. He'd learned that maintaining momentum was key to starting each day successfully. As he approached his locker, Ethan noticed Tyler Brooks and his usual companions near the drinking fountain about 20 feet away. They appeared to be engaged in an animated conversation about something that had Connor Hayes gesturing wildly and Mason Riley nodding along with forced enthusiasm. Ethan's stomach tightened slightly at their proximity, but they seemed focused on their own discussion rather than scanning for targets to torment. The combination to locker 247 came as naturally to Ethan as breathing. Right 12, left 28, right 15. The familiar click of the mechanism provided its usual small comfort, a predictable response in a world full of variables he couldn't control. He began the methodical process of retrieving his first period materials, his movements economical and precise. Mrs. Chun's advanced biology class was Ethan's favorite part of most school days. The subject matter fascinated him, particularly the mathematical precision underlying genetic patterns and cellular processes. Mrs. Chun had recognized his exceptional aptitude early in the semester and often provided him with supplementary materials that challenged his analytical abilities. Today they would be examining chromosome mapping, a topic that allowed Ethan to showcase his pattern recognition skills in ways that felt natural and comfortable. The morning progressed according to Ethan's internal schedule. Biology class went smoothly, with Mrs. Chun praising his insightful questions about genetic probability calculations. His second period calculus teacher, Mr. Henderson, returned a test on which Ethan had scored a perfect 100%. Adding a note about his elegant solution to the bonus problem that had stumped most of his classmates. These small academic victories provided bright spots in days that often felt overwhelmingly difficult. During third period, however, the familiar pattern of harassment resumed. Tyler and Connor had positioned themselves strategically in the hallway outside Ethan's English classroom, timing their presence to coincide with his arrival. As Ethan approached the door, Tyler loudly commented to Connor about freaks who think they're smarter than everyone else, while Connor responded with an exaggerated impression of Ethan's careful walking style. The performance drew snickers from several passing students, and Ethan felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck as he hurried into the classroom. English class itself provided temporary sanctuary, but Ethan found his concentration fractured by anxiety about what awaited him in the hallways. Mrs. Rodriguez was discussing symbolism in contemporary literature, a topic that normally engaged his analytical mind, but today the abstract concepts felt slippery and elusive. He found himself glancing repeatedly at the clock, calculating how much time remained before he would need to venture back into the social minefield outside. The pattern continued through fourth period and into lunch. Tyler's group seemed to have developed a sixth sense for Ethan's location, appearing at strategic moments to make their presence felt without quite crossing the line into behavior that would attract teacher intervention. They had perfected the art of harassment that lived in the gray areas of school policy, cruel enough to cause genuine distress, but subtle enough to avoid serious consequences. Sarah Martinez noticed Ethan's increasing agitation during their shared lunch period. She'd saved him a seat at her usual table near the windows, away from the basketball team's traditional territory in the center of the cafeteria. But even from their relatively safe position, she could see Tyler periodically glancing in their direction, his expression suggesting he was planning something more elaborate than his usual casual cruelty. "You seem more tense than usual today," Sarah observed quietly, hoping to draw Ethan into conversation about whatever was troubling him. She'd learned to read his moods through subtle changes in his body language and vocal patterns, skills that had developed through months of sitting near him in various classes. Ethan's response was characteristically direct but minimal. "Tyler keeps appearing wherever I go, more than usual." He took a precise bite of his sandwich, chewing methodically as he processed his thoughts. "I don't understand why they find my presence so interesting." Sarah felt a familiar surge of protective anger toward the boys, who seemed to take such pleasure in tormenting someone who had never done anything to harm them. "Maybe you should talk to someone about it, Mrs. Chun, or the guidance counselor, or even Principal Morrison." The suggestion made Ethan's shoulders tense visibly. "That would make things worse. I've observed the social dynamics here long enough to understand that formal complaints rarely improve situations like this. Usually they create more problems." His assessment was unfortunately accurate, and Sarah knew it. The unwritten rules of high school hierarchy protected popular athletes from the consequences of their behavior, while students who complained often found themselves facing increased retaliation for snitching. It was a system that perpetuated itself through fear and social pressure, and breaking it required more courage than most teenagers possessed. The afternoon brought Ethan's most challenging class of the day, physical education with Coach Reynolds. Unlike his academic courses, where his intellectual abilities provided clear advantages, PE exposed all of his physical awkwardness and social anxiety. Coach Reynolds ran his classes like military drills, with emphasis on competition and athletic performance that left students like Ethan feeling inadequate and exposed. Today's activity was basketball, which meant Tyler Brooks would be in his element while Ethan struggled with the coordination and timing required for team sports. The gymnasium echoed with the sounds of bouncing balls and squeaking sneakers as students divided into teams for scrimmage games. Ethan found himself assigned to a team that clearly viewed him as a liability, their expressions ranging from resignation to barely concealed annoyance. Tyler, naturally, was team captain for the opposing side. He'd selected his usual teammates, Connor, Mason, and several other athletic students who could help him dominate the game. But Ethan noticed something different in Tyler's demeanor today. Where his usual cruelty carried an almost casual quality, today there seemed to be a focused intensity, as if he were planning something more significant than his typical harassment. The scrimmage proceeded predictably, with Ethan's team struggling to compete against Tyler's superior athletic ability and strategic play calling. Ethan did his best to stay out of the way and avoid becoming a liability, but his unfamiliarity with the game's nuances made him an easy target for steals and blocks. Each mistake drew derisive comments from Tyler's teammates and frustrated sighs from his own. When Coach Reynolds blew his whistle to end the period, Ethan felt the familiar relief that came with surviving another PE class. Students began moving toward the locker rooms to change back into their regular clothes, and Ethan followed the flow of bodies while trying to maintain some distance from Tyler's group. The locker room was always a particularly vulnerable environment, with limited teacher supervision and numerous opportunities for accidents or pranks. However, Tyler and his friends made no move toward the locker room. Instead, they lingered near the gymnasium equipment, engaging in what appeared to be casual conversation while their eyes tracked Ethan's movements. Mason looked particularly uncomfortable, his usual easy compliance replaced by visible anxiety that suggested he knew something unpleasant was being planned. Ethan changed clothes quickly and efficiently, his movements economical and focused on minimizing his time in the exposed environment of the locker room. He'd learned to complete these transitions as rapidly as possible, reducing the opportunities for unwanted interactions or embarrassing incidents. His regular clothes felt like armor after the vulnerability of gym shorts and t-shirts. The final period of the day was study hall, held in the library where Mrs. Patterson maintained strict rules about quiet behavior and academic focus. For Ethan, this hour provided a peaceful sanctuary where he could organize his homework assignments and prepare for the evening study schedule. The library's orderly environment and predictable expectations aligned perfectly with his need for structure and routine. Tyler's group was not enrolled in the same study hall period, which usually meant Ethan could end his school day on a relatively positive note. He settled into his preferred seat near the mathematics reference section, arranging his materials with characteristic precision. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, creating patterns on the tables that Ethan found soothing and aesthetically pleasing. But today, even the library's tranquil atmosphere couldn't completely dispel his underlying anxiety. Throughout the study period, Ethan found his attention drifting from his calculus homework to concerns about what Tyler might be planning. The basketball star's behavior had carried an ominous quality that suggested something more serious than his usual casual harassment was being orchestrated. When the final bell rang at 3:15, Ethan packed his materials with even more care than usual, double-checking that everything was properly organized in his backpack. He'd arranged to stay after school for extra help in his AP chemistry class, where Mr. Davidson had offered to review some challenging concepts that would appear on next week's exam. This meant the hallways would be largely empty during his movement between the library and the science wing. The transition from the library to the chemistry classroom required navigating several long corridors that would normally be crowded with students heading to buses or after-school activities. Today, however, the emptiness created an eerie quiet that made every footstep echo off the polished floors. Ethan's internal navigation system guided him along his most efficient route, past the main office, through the humanities wing, and toward the science laboratories. As he rounded the corner near the guidance counselor's office, Ethan encountered Tyler, Connor, and Mason positioned strategically to block his path. Their presence in this particular location, at this specific time, could not be coincidental. Tyler's expression carried a predatory satisfaction that made Ethan's stomach clench with apprehension. "Well, look who we have here," Tyler said, his voice carrying the false friendliness that Ethan had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "Taking the scenic route to somewhere important?" Connor flanked Tyler's left side, his usual smirk replaced by something more intense and focused. "Yeah, Einstein, where are you rushing off to? Got a hot date with your calculator?" Mason positioned himself to Tyler's right, but his body language suggested reluctance rather than enthusiasm. His eyes avoided direct contact with Ethan, and his hands fidgeted nervously with the strap of his backpack. Whatever Tyler had planned, Mason clearly had reservations about participating. Ethan's mind raced through possible responses and escape routes. The hallway offered limited options for avoiding confrontation, with classroom doors locked and no teachers visible in the immediate area. His best strategy seemed to involve minimal engagement and swift movement toward his destination, hoping to avoid escalating whatever scenario Tyler had orchestrated. "I have a scheduled appointment with Mr. Davidson for chemistry tutoring," Ethan replied evenly, trying to step around the human barrier they had created. "I need to maintain my academic schedule." Tyler moved to block his path more directly, his athletic build making evasion difficult in the narrow corridor. "That's really interesting, Ethan, but we were thinking maybe you could spare a few minutes for a different kind of education." The threat in Tyler's voice was unmistakable now, and Ethan felt his internal alarm systems activating. His breathing became more shallow, and his hands tightened reflexively on his backpack straps. The empty hallway that had seemed peaceful moments earlier now felt isolated and dangerous. "I don't want any trouble," Ethan said, the words coming out more quietly than he'd intended. "I just want to go to my tutoring session." Connor laughed, but the sound carried no genuine humor. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble? We just want to help you with a little social experiment." Before Ethan could process what Connor meant, Tyler and Connor grabbed his arms with practiced coordination. Their grip was firm enough to prevent escape, but not quite violent enough to leave obvious bruises. Mason hung back, his discomfort with the situation increasingly apparent, but he made no move to intervene or assist Ethan. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, his voice rising with genuine panic as they began moving him down the hallway. "Let me go. I need to get to my appointment." Tyler's response was to tighten his grip and increase their walking pace. "Relax, buddy. We're just going to give you some quiet time to think about things. Consider it a meditation session." They approached locker 247, and Ethan's confusion gave way to horrified understanding of their intentions. The locker stood slightly ajar, its metal door offering a glimpse of the cramped space within. Tyler produced a combination lock from his pocket, suggesting this had been planned well in advance, rather than being a spontaneous act of cruelty. "You can't be serious," Ethan said, his voice cracking with fear. "This is illegal. It's imprisonment." Connor's smirk widened. "It's a prank drama queen. A harmless little joke to help you develop a sense of humor." Ethan's struggles intensified as they positioned him in front of the open locker, but his physical strength was no match for two athletic teenagers who had clearly rehearsed this scenario. His backpack was removed and tossed aside, its contents spilling across the hallway floor in a chaos that would have distressed him under normal circumstances. "Please don't do this," Ethan pleaded, his careful composure finally cracking under the weight of genuine terror. "I have anxiety issues. Confined spaces are particularly difficult for me." Tyler's expression showed no sympathy for Ethan's distress. "Maybe this will help you get over that. Think of it as exposure therapy." With coordinated effort, they forced Ethan into the narrow confines of locker 247. His slender frame fit, but barely, requiring him to stand at an awkward angle with his shoulders hunched and his head tilted to avoid the metal ceiling. The space smelled of rust and cleaning supplies, with barely enough room for him to shift his weight from one foot to the other. "How long are you planning to leave me here?" Ethan asked, his voice already taking on the hollow quality that came from speaking inside a metal enclosure. Tyler's answer was to slam the door shut with a resounding clang that reverberated through Ethan's confined space. The combination lock clicked into place with mechanical precision, sealing him inside the metal tomb. Their footsteps receded down the hallway, accompanied by Connor's laughter and what sounded like a brief argument between Tyler and Mason. Then silence. Ethan stood in complete darkness, his world reduced to the dimensions of a metal box barely large enough to contain his body. The initial shock gave way to a systematic assessment of the situation. The locker measured approximately 12 inches deep, 18 inches wide, and 6 feet tall. Air circulation was minimal, coming only through the narrow ventilation slits near the top of the door. The temperature was already noticeably warmer than the hallway had been. His watch, a gift from Jake that featured a luminous display, showed 3:28. Mr. Davidson would expect him in the chemistry classroom at 3:30. When Ethan failed to arrive, the teacher might assume he'd forgotten or decided not to come. It could be hours before anyone thought to look for him, and even then, they would have no reason to check inside a student locker. The first hour passed slowly, marked by Ethan's attempts to remain calm and rational. He tried the mental exercises his therapist had taught him for managing anxiety, focusing on controlled breathing and positive visualization. He recited mathematical formulas and scientific constants, using familiar patterns to maintain some sense of order and control. But as the second hour began, the physical discomfort became impossible to ignore. His legs cramped from standing in the unnatural position, and his neck ached from the constant tilt required to fit within the space. The warm, stale air made breathing increasingly difficult, and sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the metal's coolness against his back. By the third hour, Ethan's carefully maintained composure had deteriorated significantly. The darkness seemed to press against him with physical weight, and the walls felt like they were contracting with each breath. His rational mind understood that the locker's dimensions hadn't changed, but his emotional responses were overwhelming his logical processes. Panic attacks were not uncommon in Ethan's experience, but this environment amplified every symptom. His heart raced with irregular rhythms that he could hear echoing in the metal space around him. His breathing became rapid and shallow, creating a feedback loop that intensified his sense of suffocation. The mathematical formulas that usually provided comfort now seemed meaningless and disconnected from his reality. Outside, the school had emptied of students and most staff members. Custodial workers moved through the building on their evening routines, but their paths didn't typically include detailed inspections of individual lockers. The hallway where Ethan remained trapped had fallen into the quiet emptiness that characterized schools after hours. At Morrison's auto shop, Jake Parker was finishing his workday by organizing tools and completing paperwork for the vehicles he'd serviced. His internal clock told him it was nearly 6 o'clock, which meant Ethan would normally be home by now, either working on homework or helping their mother prepare dinner. Jake's protective instincts had been on high alert for weeks, picking up on subtle changes in his brother's behavior that suggested something was seriously wrong. Linda Parker arrived home from her day shift at the hospital to find their house empty and quiet. Ethan's absence wasn't immediately alarming, since he sometimes stayed after school for academic activities or library study sessions, but as 6:30 passed without word from her younger son, concern began to creep into her thoughts. Ethan was religiously punctual about communication, always calling if his schedule changed, or if he would be late returning home. By 7 o'clock, when Jake arrived home to find his mother pacing anxiously in the kitchen, they both knew something was wrong. Ethan had never failed to communicate a change in his routine, and his phone was going directly to voicemail. Jake's military training kicked in automatically, shifting him into problem-solving mode as he began systematically checking for information about his brother's whereabouts. Meanwhile, inside locker 247, Ethan had lost track of time entirely. The combination of sensory deprivation, physical discomfort, and psychological stress had created a dissociative state, where minutes felt like hours and rational thought became increasingly difficult. His legs had progressed from cramped to numb, and his attempts to shift position within the confined space had become desperate and increasingly frantic. The metal walls that had initially felt cool now radiated the heat from his body back at him, creating a stifling environment that intensified his claustrophobic panic. Every breath felt insufficient, though the rational part of his mind knew he wasn't actually suffocating. The darkness had become a living thing that pressed against his eyes and filled his lungs with each labored inhalation. His calls for help had long since stopped, partly from exhaustion and partly from the growing realization that no one was coming to look for him. The school was empty, the custodial staff had finished their rounds, and anyone who might have noticed his absence had no reason to connect his disappearance with a random locker in an empty hallway. As the evening stretched toward night, Jake Parker's concern had transformed into focused determination to find his missing brother. He'd called the school's main number, reaching only an automated system that provided no useful information. His next call went to the police department, where a bored dispatcher took basic information but explained that adults weren't considered missing persons until they'd been gone for 24 hours. Ethan was 16, which placed him in a gray area that offered little immediate assistance. Jake's frustration with official channels led him to take matters into his own hands. He knew Lincoln Valley High's campus layout from his own student days, and he understood that if Ethan was in trouble at school, waiting for authorities to take action could mean waiting too long. His brother needed help now, not after bureaucratic procedures had been satisfied. The drive to Lincoln Valley High took Jake through the quiet streets of Millbrook, past houses where families were settling in for evening routines that his own family couldn't enjoy while Ethan remained missing. The school's parking lot was empty except for a few cars belonging to custodial staff and evening security personnel. Jake parked near the main entrance and began the systematic search that his military training had taught him to conduct when lives were at stake. Inside locker 247, Ethan was approaching his breaking point. The physical discomfort had become genuine pain, with muscle cramps that sent shooting sensations through his legs and back. The psychological effects were even more severe, with panic. Attacks that came in waves and left him gasping for air that seemed increasingly thin and insufficient. His sense of time had become completely distorted. What felt like days could have been hours, or what felt like hours could have been minutes. The darkness played tricks with his perception, creating phantom lights and shapes that his oxygen-deprived brain interpreted as hallucinations. He found himself talking to Jake, carrying on conversations with his absent brother that felt real and immediate. The sound of footsteps in the hallway initially registered as another hallucination, but they grew closer and more distinct. Jake's voice, calling Ethan's name with increasing urgency, penetrated the metal walls of the locker like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "Ethan, Ethan, where are you?" The voice was real, unmistakably his brother's, and it gave Ethan the strength to respond despite his weakened condition. "Jake, I'm here. I'm in the locker." What happened next would change everything for both brothers, setting in motion events that would transform Lincoln Valley High School and everyone within it. Jake Parker's heart hammered against his ribs as he followed the sound of his brother's muffled voice down the empty corridor. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows along the rows of identical lockers, each one a potential metal prison that could be hiding Ethan. The desperation in his brother's voice cut through Jake like a blade, igniting something primal and dangerous in his chest that he hadn't felt since his tours overseas. "Keep talking to me, Ethan. I'm going to find you," Jake called out, his military training taking over as he methodically checked each locker along the hallway. His hands moved efficiently from handle to handle, testing each one while his ears strained to pinpoint the exact location of his brother's voice. The response came from locker 247, barely audible through the metal barrier, but unmistakably Ethan's voice. "Jake, I can't breathe properly. It's been hours. They locked me in here and left." The calm, measured tone that Ethan maintained even in crisis broke something inside Jake. His little brother was trapped, suffering, and trying to stay rational, while whoever had done this was probably at home eating dinner with their families. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he examined the combination lock securing the locker door, a tremor born not from fear but from the effort it took to contain the rage building inside him. "Who did this to you?" Jake asked, his voice carefully controlled while he studied the lock mechanism. The combination lock was a standard school-issued model, but without the combination, opening it would require tools he didn't have with him. Ethan's response came after a pause that suggested he was weighing whether to reveal the truth. Tyler Brooks and his friends, Connor Hayes and Mason Riley, they said it was a social experiment. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, committing those names to memory with the same precision he'd once used to memorize enemy positions and tactical intelligence. Tyler Brooks, Connor Hayes, Mason Riley. The names burned themselves into his consciousness like brands, each one representing a debt that would need to be collected. "Hang tight, brother. I'm going to get you out of there right now," Jake said, already moving toward the main office where he remembered seeing emergency tools during his own student days. The custodial closet would have bolt cutters or similar equipment that could deal with the lock. The main office door was locked, but Jake's military experience included training in rapid entry techniques for situations where lives were at stake. The lock yielded to his determined efforts, and he quickly located the custodial supply room where maintenance equipment was stored. A heavy-duty bolt cutter hung on a pegboard among other tools, and Jake grabbed it along with a flashlight before hurrying back to his trapped brother. "I'm back, Ethan. Stand away from the door as much as you can. I'm going to cut the lock." The bolt cutters made quick work of the combination lock, its metal shackle snapping under the pressure of the cutting. Blades. Jake yanked the locker door open, and Ethan practically fell out of the confined space, his legs buckling from hours of standing in the cramped position. Jake caught his brother before he could hit the floor, supporting his weight while Ethan's circulation slowly returned to his extremities. Ethan's appearance shocked Jake more than he'd expected. His brother's usually neat hair was matted with sweat, his clothes wrinkled and damp, and his face pale with exhaustion and dehydration. But it was Ethan's eyes that truly revealed the trauma he'd endured. The usual bright intelligence was clouded with something Jake recognized from his military service, the 1,000-yard stare that came from experiencing helplessness and terror. "How long were you in there?" Jake asked, helping Ethan sit down on a nearby bench while he assessed his brother's condition. Ethan checked his watch with shaking hands. 3 hours and 47 minutes. "I missed my chemistry tutoring appointment with Mr. Davidson. He probably thinks I forgot." The matter-of-fact way Ethan delivered this information, still concerned about disappointing a teacher after being imprisoned by his classmates, made Jake's anger burn even hotter. His brother's fundamental decency and trust in others had been weaponized against him by predators who saw kindness as weakness. "We need to get you to a hospital," Jake said, noticing that Ethan was still having difficulty breathing normally. "You might be dehydrated, and I want to make sure there are no other complications." Ethan shook his head weakly. "I just need to go home. I need to process what happened and return to my normal routine. Hospitals are too chaotic and unpredictable right now." Jake understood his brother's need for familiar environments when overwhelmed, but his protective instincts demanded medical evaluation. They compromised by agreeing to stop at an urgent care clinic on the way home, where a nurse practitioner could check Ethan's vital signs and ensure he hadn't suffered any serious physical effects from his ordeal. The drive to the clinic gave Jake time to think, and thinking was dangerous when this much anger was involved. His military training had taught him that emotional decisions in high-stakes situations usually led to outcomes that created more problems than they solved. But this wasn't a military operation with rules of engagement and chain of command oversight. This was his family, and someone had declared war on the most vulnerable member of it. Dr. Sarah Williams at the urgent care clinic was thorough and compassionate, taking time to explain each part of her examination while she checked Ethan's blood pressure, heart rate, and reflexes. She ordered blood tests to check for dehydration and stress hormones, and prescribed mild anti-anxiety medication to help him sleep that night. "Physically, he's going to be fine," Dr. Williams told Jake privately while Ethan was getting dressed. But what happened to him was traumatic, and the psychological effects might take longer to resolve. "Has he experienced bullying before?" Jake's jaw tightened. "Yes, but nothing this severe. I should have intervened sooner." Dr. Williams placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You can't blame yourself for other people's cruelty. The important thing now is making sure Ethan feels safe and supported while he recovers from this experience." The drive home was quiet, with Ethan staring out the passenger window at the familiar streets of Millbrook, while Jake processed the doctor's words alongside his own growing need for justice. Their mother would be frantic with worry by now, and explaining what had happened would only add to her stress and heartbreak. Linda Parker was indeed pacing the kitchen when they arrived, her nurse's uniform still wrinkled from her hospital shift and her eyes red from crying. She took one look at Ethan's condition and immediately shifted into medical mode, checking his pulse and asking rapid-fire questions about his symptoms and the care he'd received. 3 hours, she whispered after Jake explained what had happened. "They left my baby locked in a metal box for 3 hours. The pain in their mother's voice cut through Jake's careful control like a hot knife. Linda Parker had sacrificed everything to give her sons the best life she could provide. working double shifts and going without so they could have opportunities she'd never had. Watching Ethan suffer because of other people's cruelty was killing her slowly, and Jake could see the toll it was taking on her health and emotional well-being. "Mom, I'm okay," Ethan said quietly, his voice still hoarse from his ordeal. "I survived it, and now I understand their capabilities better. I can adjust my strategies accordingly." Linda hugged her younger son carefully, as if he might break if she held too tight. "You shouldn't have to strategize around people who want to hurt you. You should be able to go to school and focus on learning without worrying about your safety." Jake watched this exchange with growing determination. His mother was right. Ethan shouldn't have to live in fear, constantly calculating how to avoid predators who saw his differences as entertainment. But the school administration had already proven ineffective at stopping the harassment, and waiting for them to take meaningful action would only give Tyler and his friends more opportunities to escalate their cruelty. That night, after Ethan had finally fallen asleep with the help of Dr. Williams' medication, Jake sat in his room researching everything he could find about Tyler Brooks, Connor Hayes, and Mason Riley. Social media profiles revealed their schedules, their hangout spots, their friends and family connections. School records showed their athletic achievements and academic standings. Local news articles highlighted their basketball team's success and their status as hometown heroes. Tyler Brooks was the crown jewel of Lincoln Valley High's basketball program, with scholarship offers from several Division I universities already on the table despite being only a junior. His father owned a successful construction company, and his mother served on the school board, connections that explained his immunity from serious consequences for his behavior. Connor Hayes came from a family of local politicians, with his grandfather serving as mayor and his uncle holding a county commissioner position. His social media posts revealed a pattern of casual cruelty toward various targets, suggesting that tormenting Ethan was just the latest in a long history of bullying behavior. Mason Riley appeared to be the reluctant follower of the group, with fewer posts celebrating their harassment campaigns, and several indicators that he participated more from fear than enthusiasm. His family background was more modest than the others, making his social status entirely dependent on his association with Tyler and Connor. Jake spent hours studying their patterns, their vulnerabilities, and their support systems. Military intelligence gathering was a skill that translated well to civilian situations, and by dawn he had detailed profiles of all three boys, including their daily routines, their pressure points, and their greatest fears. The next morning brought new challenges as Ethan struggled to maintain his normal routine after the previous day's trauma. His usual precise timing was disrupted by anxiety attacks that came in waves, and his careful organization was hampered by hands that still trembled when he thought about confined spaces. Jake drove him to school despite Ethan's insistence that he could take the bus, unwilling to let his brother face potential retaliation without backup. Lincoln Valley High buzzed with rumors about Ethan's disappearance the previous afternoon. Some students had heard he'd been found locked in a locker, while others whispered about family emergencies or medical problems. The basketball team's supporters dismissed the locker story as exaggerated gossip, refusing to believe their heroes could be capable of such cruelty. Tyler Brooks strutted through the hallways with his usual confidence, showing no signs of guilt or concern about the consequences of his actions. If anything, he seemed energized by the attention the incident was generating, basking in the fearful respect that came from demonstrating his power over someone weaker. Sarah Martinez approached Ethan during first period, her expression mixing relief at seeing him with anger about what had happened. "I heard about yesterday. Are you okay? Did you report it to Principal Morrison?" Ethan's response was predictably logical, but defeatist. "Reporting it would require proof that they deliberately locked me in the locker rather than finding me there accidentally. Their word against mine, with their social status providing credibility I lack." The probability of meaningful consequences is minimal. Sarah's frustration with the unfairness of the situation was visible in her clenched fists and tight jaw. So they just get away with it? They can torture you for hours and face no consequences? That appears to be the case, Ethan agreed quietly. I'm adjusting my behavioral patterns to minimize future incidents. Avoiding isolated areas, staying near teachers when possible, maintaining situational awareness. Meanwhile, Jake was using his lunch break from Morrison's auto shop to visit Lincoln Valley, high under the pretense of discussing his community college transcripts with the guidance counselor. His real purpose was reconnaissance, observing the school's layout and gathering intelligence about Tyler's schedule and habits. Jake positioned himself strategically in the parking lot during the lunch period, watching as students emerged from the building to eat outside or leave campus for fast food. Tyler and his friends were easy to spot, their confidence and casual arrogance making them stand out among the crowd of teenagers. They commandeered a picnic table in the center of the outdoor seating area, forcing other students to navigate around their expanded territorial claim. The casual way Tyler discussed the previous day's events, laughing about Ethan's panic and speculating about whether he'd wet himself during his imprisonment, confirmed Jake's assessment that this hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment. These boys were predators who took genuine pleasure in causing suffering, and they had no intention of stopping their campaign against Ethan voluntarily. Connor Hayes seemed particularly animated in recounting the details, embellishing the story, with fictional elements designed to make Ethan appear even more pathetic and weak. His performance drew laughter from their audience of wannabes and admirers, reinforcing the social dynamics that protected their behavior from consequences. Mason Riley's participation was noticeably more subdued, but he didn't contradict their version of events or express any remorse for his role in the incident. His silence made him complicit in their cruelty, regardless of any private reservations he might have harbored. Jake memorized every detail of their interaction, from their seating arrangement to their body language to the way other students responded to their presence. Understanding group dynamics was crucial for planning effective intervention strategies, and these boys had clearly established themselves as the apex predators in Lincoln Valley High's social ecosystem. That afternoon brought fresh horrors as Tyler's group decided to test whether their actions had broken Ethan's spirit or simply made him more careful. They orchestrated a series of smaller incidents designed to gauge his psychological state and his willingness to fight back or seek help from authorities. During passing period between 5th and 6th classes, Connor deliberately shoulder-checked Ethan while he was organizing materials at his locker, sending books and papers scattering across the hallway floor. When Ethan knelt to gather his belongings, Tyler approached and accidentally stepped on his chemistry notebook, grinding his heel into the cover and tearing several pages. "Whoops," Tyler said with mock concern. "Sorry about that, Einstein. Maybe you should be more careful where you put your stuff." Ethan's response was to quietly collect his damaged materials without comment or complaint, his face carefully blank, despite the obvious distress the destruction of his organized notes was causing him. The lack of reaction seemed to disappoint Tyler, who had clearly been hoping for a more dramatic response that would provide entertainment for the growing audience of onlookers. "Not very talkative today, are you?" Connor observed, crouching down to Ethan's level with predatory intensity. "Cat got your tongue, or did yesterday's meditation session teach you some humility?" The reference to his imprisonment made Ethan flinch involuntarily, a reaction that brought satisfied smirks to both Tyler and Connor's faces. They had found a reliable trigger for causing him distress, and Jake's absence meant there was no immediate protection from further psychological torture. Sarah Martinez pushed through the crowd of spectators, her fury at the display of cruelty overriding her usual caution about confronting the basketball stars. "Leave him alone. He hasn't done anything to you." Tyler turned his attention to Sarah. with the lazy confidence of a predator who had identified a new potential target. "Oh look, the freak has a girlfriend. That's so sweet. Maybe she can help you pick up your toys." The threat in Tyler's voice was unmistakable, and several students in the crowd shifted uncomfortably as they realized the situation was escalating beyond casual harassment. Sarah's defense of Ethan had painted a target on her own back, potentially expanding the circle of victims in Tyler's campaign of terror. "We're not afraid of you," Sarah said, though the slight tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. "There are teachers everywhere, and people are recording this on their phones." Connor laughed and gestured toward the assembled students. "Go ahead and record. We're just having a friendly conversation with our classmates. Nothing inappropriate happening here." The gaslighting was expert-level manipulation, reframing their obvious intimidation as innocent social interaction while making Sarah appear paranoid and aggressive for objecting to their behavior. Several students lowered their phones, unwilling to risk being labeled as troublemakers for documenting what everyone could see was harassment. Ethan finally stood up, his damaged materials clutched against his chest and his expression carefully neutral despite the chaos swirling around him. "I need to get to class. My academic schedule is more important than this interaction." The dismissal stung Tyler's ego more than dramatic pleading or angry confrontation would have. Being treated as irrelevant by someone he considered beneath his notice challenged his self-image as the most important person in any room he entered. "Walk away then," Tyler called after Ethan as he moved toward his sixth period classroom. "But remember that we can find you anytime we want. Yesterday was just a preview of what happens when you forget your place." Jake heard about the hallway incident within hours, courtesy of a text from Sarah Martinez, who had obtained his number from Ethan's emergency contact information. Her message was brief but urgent. "They're escalating. Ethan needs help now." That evening, Jake made his decision. The school administration had proven ineffective. The police were hamstrung by lack of evidence and bureaucratic procedures, and his brother was being systematically destroyed by predators who operated with complete impunity. Traditional solutions had failed, which meant it was time for unconventional approaches. Jake's military training had taught him that sometimes violence was the only language that bullies understood, and that measured application of force could prevent larger conflicts from developing. Tyler Brooks and his friends had declared war on his family, and Jake Parker was uniquely qualified to show them exactly what war looked like when fought by someone who understood its true nature. The next phase of this conflict would be fought on Jake's terms, with rules he would establish and consequences he would enforce. Tyler Brooks was about to learn that some people's little brothers had big brothers, who took family protection very seriously indeed. Jake Parker spent the weekend conducting surveillance with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 combat deployments. He mapped Tyler Brooks' routine from morning workouts at the community gym to evening hangouts at the Dairy Queen parking lot where the basketball team gathered to show off for younger students. Every detail was cataloged, every pattern identified, every vulnerability assessed. Tyler's schedule was predictable in the way that comes from absolute confidence in one's invulnerability. Monday through Friday meant morning weight training at 6 a.m., school until 3:15, basketball practice until 5:30, then cruising Main Street with Connor and Mason until their parents demanded they come home for dinner. Weekends brought parties at various locations around town, always with Tyler as the center of attention and Connor providing the cool commentary that kept everyone entertained. The more Jake observed, the clearer it became that Tyler's cruelty wasn't limited to Ethan. During his surveillance, Jake witnessed the basketball star deliberately trip a freshman girl carrying art supplies, corner a nervous sophomore boy, and force him to hand over his lunch money, and systematically humiliate a chess club member who had the misfortune of sitting too close to the popular table in the cafeteria. Tyler Brooks was a predator who fed on the suffering of anyone he perceived as weak or different. Connor Hayes proved to be even more vicious than his leader, compensating for his secondary status by being more creative in his cruelty. Jake watched him steal a special needs student's homework and tear it up in front of a crowd, film himself mocking and code overweight girls' attempts to exercise in the gym, and spread false rumors about a quiet kid's family financial problems. Connor's need to prove himself made him reckless and cruel in ways that Tyler was too calculating to risk. Mason Riley remained the most complex of the three, clearly uncomfortable with many of their actions, but too frightened of becoming a target himself to speak up or withdraw from the group. Jake observed him hesitating before participating in their cruelest moments, sometimes attempting to redirect their attention toward less harmful activities, but ultimately lacking the courage to fully resist their influence. By Tuesday morning, Jake had completed his reconnaissance and formulated a plan that would address each boy's specific weaknesses and fears. Military strategy emphasized achieving maximum psychological impact with minimal actual violence, breaking an enemy's will to fight rather than simply inflicting physical damage. Tyler, Connor, and Mason were about to receive an education in the difference between teenage intimidation and adult consequences. Jake's first target was Connor Hayes, whose grandfather's mayoral position and family's political connections had made him feel invincible. Connor's weakness was his desperate need for social approval and his terror of being exposed as the coward he truly was beneath his cruel exterior. Jake had identified the perfect opportunity to exploit both vulnerabilities during Connor's Tuesday evening ritual of harassing younger students at the municipal park. The park sat at the center of Millbrook's recreational district, with basketball courts, playground equipment, and walking trails that attracted families and teenagers throughout the evening hours. Connor had established himself as the unofficial king of the basketball courts, using his athletic ability and vicious tongue to dominate pickup games and humiliate anyone who challenged his authority. Jake arrived at the park just as Connor was beginning his usual performance, trash-talking the group of middle school students who had been hoping to play a friendly game of basketball. The younger boys were clearly intimidated by Connor's reputation and his connection to the high school star athletes, backing down from confrontations even when they had done nothing wrong. "You kids need to learn some respect," Connor was saying as Jake approached the courts. "These courts belong to real players, not wannabe losers who can barely dribble." One of the middle schoolers, a small kid with thick glasses who reminded Jake painfully of Ethan, tried to stand up for his group. "We were here first, and there are 4 courts. Can't we just share?" Connor's response was to steal the boys' basketball and hold it above his head, forcing the shorter student to jump unsuccessfully while Connor laughed at his efforts. "Maybe when you grow a foot taller and learn how to play, you can ask nicely to use our courts." Jake had seen enough. He walked onto the court with the confident stride of someone who belonged there, his presence immediately shifting the dynamics of the situation. At 6 feet 2 inches with the build of someone who had spent years in military conditioning, Jake commanded attention without saying a word. "Afternoon," Jake said casually, addressing the group of middle schoolers while ignoring Connor entirely. "You boys waiting for a game?" The dismissal stung Connor's ego immediately. He was accustomed to being the center of attention, the dominant force that everyone else had to acknowledge and navigate around. Being treated as irrelevant by an adult triggered every insecurity he had about his actual importance in the world. "Excuse me," Connor said, stepping closer to Jake with the aggressive posture he used to intimidate younger students. "This is a private game. We don't need any old guys trying to relive their glory days." Jake finally looked at Connor, his expression neutral, but his eyes carrying the kind of intensity that came from looking death in the face and not blinking. "Private game? On a public court? That's interesting. What makes you think you have the authority to claim public property for private use?" The question was delivered in a conversational tone, but Connor sensed the challenge beneath the words. Several other teenagers had stopped their activities to watch the confrontation, drawn by the unusual sight of someone not backing down from Connor's intimidation tactics. "I'm Connor Hayes," Connor announced, as if his name should carry some weight with this stranger. "My grandfather is the mayor of this town. I think I know more about public property than some random guy." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Connor Hayes. Yes, I've heard about you. You're the kid who enjoys picking on people smaller than himself. The one who helps lock autistic students in lockers for entertainment." The words hit Connor like a physical blow. His face flushed red with a combination of embarrassment and anger, and his voice rose to a defensive pitch that carried across the park. "I don't know what you're talking about. And even if I did, what's it to you?" "That autistic student is my little brother," Jake said quietly, taking a step closer to Connor. "And what happened to him is very much my business." The admission sent a ripple of tension through the gathered crowd. Everyone at Lincoln Valley High knew about the locker incident, though most had heard sanitized versions that downplayed the cruelty involved. Seeing Connor confronted by the victim's older brother transformed the abstract story into immediate, personal consequences. Connor's bravado began to crack under the weight of genuine accountability. He glanced around desperately for Mason or Tyler, but he was alone without his usual support system. The middle school students he had been tormenting were now watching with obvious satisfaction as their tormentor faced someone closer to his own size. "Look, man, that was just a prank," Connor stammered, backing away from Jake's intimidating presence. "We didn't mean any real harm. It was Tyler's idea anyway." "A prank," Jake repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. 3 hours locked in a metal box barely large enough to stand in. That's your definition of harmless fun? Connor's retreat continued as Jake advanced, the basketball star's usual confidence evaporating in the face of someone who wasn't impressed by his reputation or intimidated by his family connections. The crowd of teenagers formed a loose circle around them, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I think you need to learn what it feels like to be trapped and helpless," Jake continued, his military training evident in the calculated way he used proximity and psychological pressure to break down Connor's resistance. "To understand the fear and panic my brother experienced because of your entertainment. You can't threaten me," Connor shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "My family has connections. You'll go to jail." Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Threaten you? I'm just talking about education. Maybe some community service that helps you develop empathy for the people you've been hurting." Without warning, Jake moved with the speed and precision of his military training, grabbing Connor's wrist and applying a pressure point technique that immediately brought the teenager to his knees. The move was completely legal, a standard restraint method that caused no permanent damage but created intense discomfort and complete helplessness. "This is what powerlessness feels like," Jake said calmly as Connor writhed in his grip. "This is what you put my brother through, except he was trapped for hours while you walked away laughing." Connor's tough guy facade crumbled completely as tears of pain and humiliation streamed down his face. The middle school students watched in amazement as their tormentor was reduced to begging for mercy from someone who understood real strength, rather than the artificial power that came from bullying the vulnerable. "Please," Connor sobbed, his voice barely recognizable. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. It won't happen again." Jake maintained the pressure for another 30 seconds, long enough to ensure that Connor would never forget the sensation of being completely at someone else's mercy. Then he released the grip and stepped back, leaving Connor curled on the asphalt, nursing his wrist and his wounded pride. "If my brother faces any more harassment from you or your friends," Jake said loud enough for everyone to hear, "this conversation will seem like a friendly chat compared to what happens next. Do we understand each other?" Connor nodded frantically, unable to meet Jake's eyes or acknowledge the crowd that had witnessed his complete humiliation. The legend of Connor Hayes, the untouchable bully with powerful family connections, had died on the basketball court in front of a dozen witnesses who would spread the story throughout Lincoln Valley High by morning. Jake's second target was Mason Riley, whose weakness lay in his fundamental cowardice and his desperate desire to avoid becoming a victim himself. Mason's participation in the harassment of Ethan was driven by fear rather than cruelty, making him potentially redeemable but also requiring a different approach than the one used on Connor. Wednesday evening found Mason at his part-time job at Millbrook Electronics, a small computer repair shop where he worked to help his family pay bills. Unlike Tyler and Connor, Mason came from a family that struggled financially, making his job essential to their household budget and his connection to the basketball stars his only protection from becoming a target himself. Jake entered the store just before closing time, when Mason was alone and responsible for locking up. The teenager's recognition was immediate and visceral, his face paling as he realized who had walked through the door. Word of Connor's humiliation had spread quickly through the school's social networks, and Mason understood that his turn for accountability had arrived. "Good evening," Jake said politely, approaching the counter where Mason stood frozen with fear. "I was hoping you could help me with a computer problem." Mason's voice came out as barely a whisper. "We're closing soon. Maybe you could come back tomorrow?" "This won't take long," Jake assured him, pulling out his phone and setting it on the counter. "I have some videos I need to recover from a damaged device. Important family memories that I can't afford to lose." The mention of family memories made Mason flinch, understanding the implication even if Jake hadn't stated it directly. Everyone knew about the connection between Jake and Ethan, and Mason's guilt over his role in the locker incident had been eating away at him for days. "I heard about what happened to Connor yesterday," Mason said nervously, his hands shaking, as he pretended to examine Jake's phone. "People are saying you attacked him." Jake shook his head. "I educated him about the consequences of his choices. There's a difference between attack and accountability, though I understand the confusion. For someone who's never faced real consequences before." Mason's face crumpled with the weight of his guilt and fear. Unlike Connor, who had reveled in his cruelty, Mason genuinely regretted his participation in tormenting Ethan. His conscience had been torturing him since the locker incident, but his fear of becoming a target himself had prevented him from speaking up or seeking forgiveness. "I didn't want to hurt your brother," Mason said quietly, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Tyler and Connor made it seem like a harmless prank. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared they'd turn on me if I didn't go along." Jake studied the teenager carefully, his military experience helping him distinguish between genuine remorse and manipulative self-preservation. Mason's distress appeared authentic, suggesting that redemption might be possible if approached correctly. "Fear is understandable," Jake said gently, his tone shifting from intimidating to instructional. "But using fear as an excuse to participate in cruelty makes you complicit in the harm caused. My brother spent 3 hours trapped in that locker because you chose to protect yourself instead of doing what you knew was right." Mason broke down completely, his guilt and shame overwhelming his ability to maintain composure. "I know. I've barely slept since it happened. Every time I close my eyes, I think about him trapped in there while we walked away. But what was I supposed to do? If I'd stood up to Tyler, I would have become his next target. So you made sure someone else stayed in the target position instead," Jake observed. "You sacrificed my brother's safety to protect your own social status." The harsh truth of Jake's words cut deeper than any physical punishment could have. Mason's realization that his cowardice had contributed to genuine suffering broke something inside him, stripping away the rationalizations he had used to justify his behavior. "What do you want from me?" Mason asked through his tears. "I can't undo what happened. I can't take back those 3 hours." Jake leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. You can ensure it never happens again. You can find the courage to stand up instead of standing by. And you can help me make sure Tyler understands that his reign of terror is over." Mason looked up with surprise and hope. "You want me to help you?" "Tyler's power comes from people being afraid to oppose him," Jake explained. "But if his own friends start refusing to participate in his cruelty, that power disappears. You have a choice, Mason. You can continue being part of the problem, or you can become part of the solution." The offer of redemption rather than punishment affected Mason profoundly. For the first time since the incident, he saw a path forward. That didn't involve living with crushing guilt or constant fear of retaliation. Jake was offering him a chance to reclaim his integrity and protect others instead of sacrificing them. "What do you need me to do?" Mason asked, wiping his eyes and straightening his shoulders with newfound determination. Jake's final target was Tyler Brooks himself, the architect of Ethan's suffering and the center of Lincoln Valley High's culture of cruelty. Tyler's destruction would require more than physical intimidation or moral education. It would require dismantling the entire support system that enabled his behavior and exposing him as the coward he truly was beneath his athletic swagger. Thursday afternoon brought Lincoln Valley High's most important basketball practice of the season, a final preparation session before their opening game against their biggest rivals. The gymnasium was packed with students, parents, and local reporters covering the team that had brought glory to their small town. Tyler was in his element, performing for the cameras and basking in the adoration of fans who saw him as a hometown hero. Jake arrived at the practice session with Ethan, both brothers taking seats in the visitor section, where they could observe without drawing immediate attention. Ethan's presence at the basketball practice surprised many students who assumed he would be too traumatized to voluntarily be in the same building as his tormentors. But Ethan's attendance was part of Jake's strategy. His brother's visible recovery and Jake's protective presence sent a message that the harassment had not achieved its intended goal of breaking Ethan's spirit or driving him into hiding. Instead, it had awakened something far more dangerous. A protector who understood both justice and vengeance. Tyler noticed the Parker brothers immediately, his confident smile faltering as he realized the implications of their presence. Connor's humiliation and Mason's obvious distress had already begun to crack the foundation of his power, and seeing Ethan in the gymnasium felt like a direct challenge to his authority. Coach Reynolds was putting the team through their final drills when Jake stood up and walked toward the court. His movement drew attention from spectators and players alike, creating a ripple of tension that spread throughout the gymnasium. Tyler stopped dribbling and stared as Jake approached, his mind racing through possible scenarios for this confrontation. "Tyler Brooks," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet gymnasium. "I need to speak with you." Coach Reynolds stepped forward protectively, recognizing the potential threat to his star player and the team's championship hopes. "This is a closed practice. You need to leave the gymnasium immediately." Jake ignored the coach, keeping his focus on Tyler while addressing the assembled crowd. "My name is Jake Parker. Some of you know my younger brother Ethan, the autistic student that Tyler and his friends locked in a locker for 3 hours last week." The revelation sent shockwaves through the gymnasium. Parents exchanged horrified glances. Reporters suddenly focused their attention on Tyler instead of the practice drills, and students began pulling out phones to record what was clearly going to be a significant confrontation. "That's enough," Coach Reynolds shouted, moving to physically block Jake's approach to Tyler. "I'm calling security." "Please do," Jake replied calmly. "I'm sure they'll be interested in discussing the school's liability for allowing students to be imprisoned and tortured by their classmates. I'm sure the media will be interested too." Tyler's face had gone pale as he realized that his protective bubble was finally being punctured by someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. The crowd of supporters that usually made him feel invincible now felt like an audience for his exposure and downfall. "I don't know what you think you're proving," Tyler said, trying to maintain his composure while backing away from Jake's advance. "That was just kids being kids. Nobody got seriously hurt." Jake's smile was cold and predatory. "Nobody got seriously hurt? Let me tell you about the panic attacks my brother still has. Let me tell you about the nightmares that wake him up screaming. Let me tell you about the way he flinches now whenever he hears locker doors slam." Each revelation hit Tyler like a physical blow, stripping away his ability to minimize or dismiss the consequences of his actions. The crowd's sympathy was shifting dramatically as they realized the true scope of what had been done to Ethan in their name. "You want to know about serious hurt?" Jake continued, pulling out his phone and projecting his voice so everyone could hear. "Let me show you what 3 hours of psychological torture looks like." The video Jake played was from the security camera that had captured Ethan's rescue from the locker. The footage showed Jake cutting through the lock, Ethan's collapse when the door opened, and the clear evidence of his physical and emotional distress. The timestamp confirmed that he had indeed been trapped for over 3 hours. The gymnasium erupted in gasps and angry murmurs as the reality of Tyler's cruelty was displayed for everyone to see. Parents covered their children's eyes, reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks, and students stared at Tyler with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Tyler's legendary composure finally cracked under the weight of public exposure and accountability. "You can't prove I did anything. That video doesn't show how he got in there." "You're right," Jake admitted, putting away his phone. "That video only shows the rescue. But this video shows the imprisonment." The second video was Mason's insurance policy, recorded on his phone during the actual incident as protection against potential legal consequences. His cooperation with Jake had included turning over the evidence that definitively proved Tyler and Connor's guilt in the locker incident. The new footage showed Tyler and Connor forcing Ethan into the locker while Mason watched nervously from the side. Tyler's face was clearly visible as he slammed the door shut and attached the lock, sealing Ethan inside while laughing about teaching him a lesson. The audio captured their cruel jokes about Ethan's panic and their speculation about how long they should leave him trapped. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Parents began shouting demands for Tyler's arrest. Reporters pressed forward with urgent questions, and students who had previously worshipped the basketball star now looked at him with horror and revulsion. Coach Reynolds tried desperately to control the situation, but the damage was irreversible. Tyler's world collapsed in real time as scholarship offers evaporated. Criminal charges became inevitable, and his status as a hometown hero transformed into community pariah. The power structure that had protected him for years crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence and public outrage. But Jake wasn't finished. His final act was personal, designed to ensure that Tyler understood the true cost of his cruelty. On an emotional level that would last long after legal consequences had been served. "You think you're tough because you can intimidate children," Jake said, stepping closer to Tyler as the crowd watched in fascination. "But real strength isn't about hurting people weaker than yourself. Real strength is protecting those who can't protect themselves." Tyler backed away until he hit the gymnasium wall, trapped between Jake's advance and the cold concrete. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing the helplessness and fear that he had inflicted on countless victims. "Please," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible over the crowd's angry murmurs. "I'm sorry. I didn't know it would affect him so badly." Jake stopped just inches from Tyler's face, close enough that only the basketball star could hear his next words. "My brother forgives you because that's who he is. But I don't. And if you ever come near him again, you'll discover exactly what 3 years of military combat training can accomplish." The threat was delivered in a conversational tone, but Tyler heard the absolute certainty behind it. This wasn't teenage posturing or empty intimidation. This was a promise from someone who had the skills and motivation to follow through on his words. Jake stepped back and addressed the crowd one final time. Tyler Brooks is finished at this school and in this community, but this isn't really about him. This is about all of us deciding what kind of people we want to be. Do we protect the vulnerable, or do we enable their predators? Do we stand up for what's right, or do we stay silent while cruelty flourishes? The questions hung in the air as Jake walked back to Ethan, helping his brother stand and preparing to leave the gymnasium. Their work here was done. Tyler's power was broken, Connor was humiliated, Mason was redeemed, and the entire school had been forced to confront the culture of cruelty they had allowed to flourish. As the Parker brothers walked toward the exit, spontaneous applause began among the parents and spread throughout the gymnasium. Students who had been Tyler's victims stood up and clapped, their relief and gratitude obvious. Even some of the basketball players joined in, recognizing that their team's reputation had been poisoned by Tyler's behavior. Outside the gymnasium, Ethan looked up at his older brother with something approaching awe. "You didn't have to do all of that for me." Jake put his arm around Ethan's shoulders, the gesture protective and proud. "Yes, I did. That's what family means. We protect each other, no matter what." The drive home took them past the scenes of Jake's campaign, the basketball court where Connor learned about accountability, the electronics store where Mason found redemption, and the school where Tyler's empire finally crumbled. Each location represented a lesson in the difference between power and strength, between fear and respect. At home, Linda Parker waited with dinner and the local news playing on television. The story of Tyler Brooks' downfall was already spreading beyond Millbrook, picked up by regional news outlets as an example of how communities could address bullying when traditional methods failed. The video evidence had gone viral on social media, ensuring that Tyler's cruelty would follow him wherever he tried to rebuild his life. That night, for the first time since the locker incident, Ethan slept through the night without nightmares. His ordeal was over. His brother had kept his promise to protect him, and Lincoln Valley High School would never again be a place where cruelty went unchallenged. Jake Parker had taught an entire community that some people's little brothers have. Big brothers who take family protection very seriously indeed. The lesson would not be forgotten. The news vans arrived at Lincoln Valley High School before dawn on Friday morning, their satellite dishes and camera crews transforming the quiet suburban campus into a media circus. The video evidence of Tyler Brooks' cruelty had exploded across social media platforms overnight, generating millions of views and thousands of comments from outraged viewers around the world. What had begun as a local bullying incident had evolved into a national conversation about school safety, athletic privilege, and community responsibility. Principal Morrison stood at his office window, watching the chaos unfold in the parking lot, his career flashing before his eyes as reporters set up their equipment and prepared to dissect every failure of his administration. The phone had been ringing constantly since midnight, with calls from district officials, school board members, and angry parents demanding explanations for how such systematic abuse had been allowed to flourish under his watch. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Mason Riley's video footage showed Tyler and Connor forcing Ethan into the locker with calculated cruelty, their laughter and jokes about his suffering captured in high-definition clarity. The timestamp proved the duration of his imprisonment, while the security footage of his rescue provided heartbreaking documentation of the trauma they had inflicted. Superintendent Williams arrived at 7 a.m. with a crisis management team and a stack of legal documents that would reshape Lincoln Valley High's administration. Principal Morrison's resignation letter was already drafted and waiting for his signature, while Coach Reynolds faced suspension pending a full investigation into his role in protecting abusive athletes. The entire power structure that had enabled Tyler's reign of terror was crumbling, under the weight of public scrutiny and legal liability. Tyler Brooks himself was nowhere to be found on campus that morning. His parents had retained an expensive criminal defense attorney and were reportedly considering relocating to another state to escape the media attention and community outrage. The scholarship offers that had once seemed guaranteed were being withdrawn one by one as college recruiters distanced themselves from the toxic publicity surrounding their former top prospect. Connor Hayes faced a similar downfall, though his family's political connections provided slightly more protection from immediate consequences. His grandfather, the mayor, had called for a thorough investigation into the incident while privately arranging for Connor to transfer to a private school in another district. The Hayes family's reputation for public service was being tarnished by association with their grandson's documented cruelty. Mason Riley's cooperation with the investigation had earned him a degree of community sympathy, but his future at Lincoln Valley High remained uncertain. The video evidence showed his clear participation in the incident, regardless of his apparent reluctance or subsequent remorse. His family's financial struggles meant that private school wasn't an option, leaving him to face the consequences of his choices within the same community he had helped harm. Sarah Martinez arrived at school that morning to find herself surrounded by reporters eager for comments from someone who had witnessed the harassment firsthand. Her defense of Ethan during the hallway confrontation had been captured on several student cell phone videos, making her an unexpected hero in the narrative of institutional failure and peer indifference. "Ethan Parker is one of the kindest, most intelligent people I've ever known," Sarah told the cameras, her voice steady despite the overwhelming attention. What Tyler and his friends did to him wasn't a prank or a joke. It was calculated torture designed to break his spirit and drive him away from school. The fact that it took his brother's intervention to stop it shows how completely our school system failed to protect its most vulnerable students. Inside the school building, the atmosphere was surreal and tense. Students whispered in hallways about the dramatic confrontation in the gymnasium, sharing secondhand accounts and cell phone footage that had captured various moments of Tyler's public destruction. Some expressed satisfaction that the notorious bullies had finally faced consequences, while others worried about the negative attention being focused on their school and community. Mrs. Chun found herself fielding questions from investigators about her observations of Ethan's treatment and the school's response to reported harassment. Her detailed documentation of incidents and her frustrated attempts to intervene through proper channels provided a timeline of institutional negligence that would prove crucial in subsequent legal proceedings. "I reported my concerns about Tyler's behavior to administration multiple times," Mrs. Chun explained to investigators. "I was told that without concrete evidence of physical violence, there was little they could do to discipline students with such strong community support." The message was clear that protecting the basketball program's success took priority over protecting vulnerable students from psychological abuse. The Special Education Department underwent immediate review as district officials attempted to assess whether proper accommodations and protections had been in place for students like Ethan. Federal disability rights organizations had taken interest in the case, viewing it as an example of systemic failure to protect students with autism from targeted harassment and discrimination. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a nationally recognized expert on autism and school bullying, arrived from the State University to conduct an independent assessment of Lincoln Valley High's policies and procedures. Her preliminary findings suggested a pattern of inadequate response to reported incidents involving special needs students, with particular concern about the intersection of athletic privilege and administrative indifference. What happened to Ethan Parker represents a perfect storm of institutional failures, Dr. Hendricks explained to the gathered media. "You have a vulnerable student with a documented disability, clear evidence of escalating harassment, multiple failed opportunities, for intervention and a power structure that prioritized protecting popular athletes over ensuring student safety. This case will likely become a textbook example of how not to handle bullying in educational settings. Jake Parker found himself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight as news outlets sought interviews with the military veteran who had taken justice into his own hands when institutional channels failed. His methodical dismantling of Tyler's support network and his dramatic confrontation in the gymnasium had captured public imagination, with many viewing him as a hero who had done what school officials were unwilling or unable to accomplish. "I didn't set out to become a public figure," Jake told a reporter from the regional television station. "I just wanted to protect my little brother and ensure that no other student would suffer the way Ethan did." The fact that it took a civilian intervention to stop documented abuse says everything about the system's priorities and effectiveness. The Parker family's home became a gathering point for supporters from throughout the community, with neighbors, former teachers, and complete strangers stopping by to express their admiration for Jake's actions and their support for Ethan's recovery. The front porch filled with flowers, cards, and small gifts from people who had been moved by the story and wanted to show their solidarity. Linda Parker struggled to process the transformation of her family's private trauma into a public cause. Celebra. Her natural instinct to protect her son's privacy conflicted with the broader implications of their story and its potential to help other families facing similar challenges. The nursing supervisor at Millbrook General Hospital had granted her extended leave to deal with the media attention and help her sons navigate their newfound notoriety. "I'm proud of both my boys," Linda told a journalist from the state newspaper. Jake for standing up for his brother, and Ethan for his courage in surviving this ordeal and continuing to pursue his education, despite everything he's been through. "But I wish it had never been necessary. No family should have to fight this hard just to ensure their child's safety at school." Ethan himself remained largely removed from the media circus, preferring to focus on his studies and his gradual emotional recovery from the trauma he had endured. The attention made him uncomfortable, but he understood its importance in preventing similar incidents from affecting other vulnerable students. His therapist had helped him develop coping strategies for managing the anxiety that came with sudden public recognition. The academic community responded to Ethan's story with an outpouring of support and recognition for his intellectual abilities. Several universities reached out to offer early admission opportunities, recognizing that his exceptional mathematical and analytical skills deserved nurturing in an environment free from harassment and prejudice. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology sent a particularly moving letter expressing their admiration for his resilience and inviting him to participate in their summer program for gifted students. Ethan's brilliance was always evident to those who took the time to look beyond surface differences, wrote Dr. Jennifer Walsh from MIT's Department of Mathematics. The fact that he maintained his academic excellence while enduring systematic persecution speaks to a strength of character that will serve him well in higher education and beyond. We would be honored to help him develop his talents in an environment where intelligence is celebrated rather than punished. The legal consequences for Tyler and Connor began to unfold as the district attorney's office formally filed charges of unlawful imprisonment, assault, and violation of civil rights. The Federal Department of Education launched an investigation into potential violations of disability rights laws, while civil rights organizations prepared lawsuits seeking damages and systematic reforms. Tyler's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea agreement that would allow his client to avoid prison time in exchange for community service and mandatory counseling. However, the overwhelming public attention and political pressure made leniency difficult for prosecutors to justify. The video evidence left little room for alternative interpretations of the defendant's actions and intentions. Connor's legal situation was complicated by his family's political connections and their ability to afford expensive representation. However, The clear evidence of his enthusiastic participation in Ethan's imprisonment made it difficult to argue for reduced charges or alternative sentencing. His grandfather's mayoral campaign faced serious damage as opponents highlighted the family's failure to instill basic moral values in their privileged son. Mason's cooperation with the investigation and his obvious remorse earned him consideration for a plea agreement that would emphasize rehabilitation over punishment. Youth advocacy organizations argued that his case demonstrated the complex dynamics of peer pressure and social survival that could lead otherwise decent young people to participate in cruel behavior against their better judgment. The Lincoln Valley High School basketball program faced an uncertain future as the scandal destroyed their reputation and led to the departure of key players and coaching staff. Several team members requested transfers to other schools, unwilling to be associated with the toxic culture that had enabled abuse of vulnerable students. The State Athletic Association launched an investigation into the program's culture and oversight procedures. Coach Reynolds' suspension became permanent termination, as investigators uncovered a pattern of protecting problem athletes from academic and disciplinary consequences. Former players came forward with stories of harassment and intimidation that had been ignored or covered up to maintain the team's competitive advantage. The culture of athletic privilege that had protected Tyler was exposed as systematic and deeply embedded in the school's power structure. The broader Millbrook community struggled to reconcile their pride in the basketball program success with the documented evidence of the cruelty it had fostered and protected. Local businesses that had sponsored the team faced pressure to explain their support for an organization that had enabled student abuse. The annual athletic banquet was canceled as organizers grappled with the impossibility of celebrating achievements tainted by moral failure. Church leaders throughout the community used Sunday sermons to address the ethical implications of the incident, challenging congregations to examine their own roles in creating and maintaining social hierarchies that enabled the strong to prey upon the weak. The Millbrook Ministerial Alliance issued a joint statement calling for community-wide reflection on values and priorities. We must ask ourselves difficult questions about the culture we have created, read the ministerial statement. When we celebrate athletic achievement while ignoring moral character, when we excuse cruelty as boys being boys, when we prioritize winning over basic human decency, we create the conditions that make tragedies like this inevitable. Our community must commit to fundamental changes in how we define success and what behaviors we will tolerate from our young people. The school board faced mounting pressure to implement comprehensive reforms addressing bullying prevention, special needs student protection, and athletic department oversight. Parents packed monthly meetings demanding answers about systemic failures and concrete steps to prevent similar incidents. Several board members announced they would not seek re-election, acknowledging their role in creating the culture that had enabled Tyler's abuse. New policies were drafted requiring mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and responding to harassment of special needs students. Anonymous reporting systems were established to allow students and staff to report concerning behavior without fear of retaliation. Athletic programs were placed under enhanced oversight, with clear consequences for coaches who failed to address character issues among their players. Dr. Martinez, a nationally recognized expert in school culture reform, was hired as a consultant to help Lincoln Valley High implement systemic changes. Her initial assessment identified multiple areas where policies and practices had prioritized institutional reputation over student welfare, creating an environment where abuse could flourish unchecked. Meaningful change requires more than new policies on paper, Dr. Martinez explained to the school board. It requires a fundamental shift in culture and priorities, with clear consequences for adults who fail to protect vulnerable students. The community must decide whether they want schools that produce winning teams or schools that produce decent human beings. Those goals are not mutually exclusive, but they require different approaches to leadership and accountability. The ripple effects of Ethan's story extended far beyond Millbrook as other communities examined their own schools and athletic programs for similar problems. Social media campaigns encouraged students nationwide to share their experiences with bullying and institutional indifference, creating a movement for broader educational reforms. Documentary filmmakers expressed interest in chronicling the case as an example of how individual courage could catalyze systemic change. Publishers reached out about book deals that would allow the Parker family to share their story with a wider audience. However, Jake and Linda remained focused on Ethan's recovery and education rather than capitalizing on their unexpected fame. The psychological impact on Ethan continued to be a primary concern as he worked with therapists to process both the original trauma and the overwhelming attention that followed its revelation. Support groups for bullying victims provided connection with others who understood his experiences, while academic mentors helped him maintain focus on his educational goals. "Recovery isn't linear," explained Dr. Susan Chun, Ethan's therapist. "While the public response has been overwhelmingly supportive, the attention itself can be traumatic for someone who prefers predictability and privacy. We're working on strategies to help him maintain emotional stability while navigating this new reality." Jake's own adjustment to public recognition proved challenging, as he struggled with the label of hero that had been attached to his actions. His military training had emphasized team accomplishment over individual glory, making the personal attention uncomfortable despite his satisfaction with the results of his intervention. "I did what any brother would do," Jake insisted in interviews. "The real heroes are the people like Sarah Martinez who tried to help Ethan when it would have been easier to look the other way. The real heroes are the investigators and reporters who are holding institutions accountable for their failures. I just provided the final push that brought everything into the light." The criminal trials began 6 months after the incident, with Tyler and Connor facing serious charges that could result in prison sentences and permanent criminal records. The courthouse was packed with supporters of the Parker family, creating an atmosphere of accountability that had been absent from the school environment where the abuse had occurred. Tyler's testimony revealed the shallow entitlement and casual cruelty that had driven his behavior, with little evidence of genuine remorse or understanding of the harm he had caused. His attorney's attempts to portray the incident as a momentary lapse in judgment were undermined by evidence of systematic harassment spanning months. Connor's defense strategy centered on diminished responsibility due to peer pressure and family dysfunction, though prosecutors argued that his enthusiastic participation and creative cruelty demonstrated clear moral agency in choosing to participate in Ethan's abuse. The contrast between his courtroom tears and his documented laughter during the incident undermined claims of reluctant participation. Mason's testimony proved crucial in establishing the premeditated nature of the imprisonment and the defendant's awareness of Ethan's vulnerability. His obvious remorse and cooperation with authorities earned him a suspended sentence with community service requirements, focused on anti-bullying education and support for special needs students. The verdicts delivered justice that had been denied by the school system, with Tyler receiving 18 months in juvenile detention, followed by probation and mandatory counseling. Connor received 12 months detention with similar post-release requirements. Both were required to issue public apologies and participate in educational programs about disability rights and the impact of bullying on victims. The civil lawsuits that followed resulted in significant financial settlements for the Parker family, though Jake and Linda donated much of the money to organizations supporting bullying prevention and autism advocacy. The school district implemented comprehensive reforms and established a scholarship fund in Ethan's name for students with disabilities who demonstrated academic excellence despite facing social challenges. Ethan's high school graduation came 2 years early, as his accelerated academic program allowed him to complete requirements while avoiding the social pressures of traditional classroom environments. His acceptance to MIT's prestigious mathematics program represented a triumph over those who had tried to diminish his potential through cruelty and intimidation. The graduation ceremony became a celebration not just of Ethan's academic achievements, but of the community's commitment to protecting and nurturing all students, regardless of their differences. Jake served as the keynote speaker, sharing lessons about the importance of standing up for vulnerable members of society and the responsibility of institutions to create safe learning environments. My brother's story could have ended very differently. Jake told the assembled graduates and their families. He could have been broken by the cruelty he faced, driven away from education and social participation by those who saw his differences as entertainment. Instead, he's heading to one of the world's most prestigious universities to study advanced mathematics. That transformation happened because people chose to stand up instead of stand by, because institutions chose accountability over reputation, and because a community decided that protecting the vulnerable was more important than protecting the powerful. Ethan's brief speech focused on gratitude rather than grievance, thanking those who had supported him and expressing hope that his experience would help create safer schools for future students facing similar challenges. His composure and eloquence surprised many, who still remembered the frightened boy who had been rescued from locker 247. "I learned that intelligence and kindness are not weaknesses to be exploited, but strengths to be celebrated," Ethan said. "I learned that standing up for what's right sometimes requires courage we didn't know we possessed. Most importantly, I learned that we all have the power to choose whether we use our abilities to help or to harm others." The Parker family's story became a case study in universities and education programs, demonstrating how individual courage could catalyze institutional change and community transformation. Researchers studied the incident as an example of effective intervention in bullying situations and the importance of family support in helping victims recover from trauma. 5 years later, Ethan completed his PhD in mathematics at age 21, with his dissertation focusing on algorithmic solutions to resource allocation problems in underserved communities. His work earned recognition from humanitarian organizations and tech companies interested in applying mathematical modeling to social justice issues. Jake completed his associate degree and opened his own auto repair business, employing several young veterans who were transitioning to civilian careers. He remained actively involved in anti-bullying advocacy and frequently spoke at schools about recognizing and responding to harassment of vulnerable students. Linda Parker earned her degree in special education and became a consultant helping schools develop better support systems for students with disabilities. Her expertise, derived from personal experience navigating institutional failures, proved invaluable in creating policies that prioritize student welfare over administrative convenience. Tyler Brooks served his sentence and eventually earned his GED while working in construction, his athletic dreams permanently derailed by the consequences of his choices. His case was frequently cited in discussions about the importance of character development in youth sports programs. Connor Hayes transferred to a private school and later attended college in another state, maintaining a low profile while pursuing business studies. His family's political career never recovered from the scandal, serving as a reminder that public service requires moral leadership that extends to personal behavior. Mason Riley graduated from Lincoln Valley High and attended community college while working to support his family. His experience as both perpetrator and advocate in the case led him to career in social work, focusing on helping young people make better choices in difficult social situations. The changes at Lincoln Valley High persisted long after the media attention faded, with new leadership committed to maintaining the cultural transformation that had emerged from crisis. Annual recognition programs celebrated students who demonstrated kindness and inclusion rather than just athletic or academic achievement. Sarah Martinez became a special education teacher, inspired by her experience defending Ethan to dedicate her career to supporting vulnerable students. She maintained contact with the Parker family and frequently shared their story with educators, seeking to understand the impact of peer advocacy in bullying situations. Mrs. Chen received recognition from national education organizations for her persistent advocacy on behalf of special needs students. Her detailed documentation of the institutional failures in Ethan's case became a template for other educators seeking to hold administrators accountable for student protection. The locker where Ethan had been imprisoned was removed from the school and replaced with a memorial plaque dedicating the space to the principle that every student deserves dignity, respect, and safety in their educational environment. The plaque served as a daily reminder of the cost of indifference and the power of standing up for what's right. Years later, when Ethan received international recognition for his mathematical contributions to sustainable development, reporters would still occasionally ask about his high school experience and its impact on his life and work. His responses consistently emphasized the importance of the support he received, rather than dwelling on the trauma he had endured. "People often focus on what was done to me," Ethan would say, "but I prefer to remember what was done for me. My brother's courage, Sarah's friendship, the investigator's diligence, the community's support, all of these showed me that most people choose kindness when given the opportunity. That lesson has shaped everything I've accomplished since." The Parker family story ultimately became one of triumph over adversity, institutional accountability over systematic failure, and the power of family bonds to overcome even the darkest challenges. It served as proof that individual courage, when combined with community support and institutional reform, could create lasting change that protected future generations from similar harm. The legacy lived on in safer schools, more accountable institutions, and young people who understood that their choices mattered, not just for themselves, but for the most vulnerable members of their communities. What had begun as a story of cruelty and institutional failure became a testament to the possibility of justice, redemption, and transformation when people chose to stand up for what was right. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.